The year is 1954. America is a nation holding its breath, caught between the lingering glow of post-war prosperity and the chilling shadow of the Cold War. In the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, lives a man named Robert Lang. To his neighbors, he is the epitome of the American dream, a diligent engineer at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, a loving husband to his wife, Eleanor, and a father to 2 young children. His life is a predictable sequence of neatly trimmed lawns, Sunday barbecues, and the comforting hum of a brand-new Chevrolet in the driveway. He is, by all accounts, an ordinary man. But ordinary men don't just vanish. It happened on a Tuesday, October 12th. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves were turning shades of fire and gold. Robert left for work at 7:30 a.m., just as he did every morning. He kissed Eleanor goodbye, promising to be home in time for dinner. He was scheduled to present a new fuselage design concept in a senior-level meeting that afternoon. But Robert Lang never arrived at the NACA facility. His car, the polished blue Chevrolet, was found 2 days later, parked near a desolate stretch of the Lake Erie shoreline. The doors were unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. Inside, on the passenger seat, was his briefcase. Everything was in order: design schematics, research notes, a half-eaten apple, and a copy of Popular Mechanics. The only thing missing was Robert himself. Detective Frank Miller was assigned the case. A grizzled veteran of the Cleveland PD, Miller had seen it all, or so he thought. The scene at the car was unnervingly clean. No signs of a struggle, no fingerprints other than Lang's. It was as if the man had simply evaporated. Miller's first interview was with a distraught Eleanor Lang. Through her tears, she painted a portrait of a stable, predictable man. He wasn't unhappy, she insisted, clutching a damp handkerchief. He loved his job. He loved us. He would never just leave. Someone must have taken him. But there was no ransom note, no threat, no motive. Miller's investigation at NACA, the predecessor to NASA, was met with a wall of quiet, bureaucratic resistance. Lang's boss, a stern man named Arthur Vance, described him as brilliant but reserved. Robert was a ghost, Vance stated, his words clipped and precise. He did his work, did it better than anyone, but he kept to himself. We all work on sensitive projects here, detective. Discretion is part of the job. When Miller pressed for details about Lang's final project, Vance's eyes narrowed. That information is classified. I'm afraid I can't help you. Days turned into weeks. The local papers ran a few stories, but with no new leads, the disappearance of Robert Lang faded from the headlines, becoming just another local mystery. Miller, however, couldn't let it go. There was a loose thread he couldn't stop pulling at. Tucked inside the Popular Mechanics magazine from Lang's car, he'd found something odd, a single classified ad circled in red pencil. It read, *, the cardinal sings at dawn. Looking for fellow birdwatchers. Box 782. *, it seemed innocuous, a simple message for a hobbyist group. But why circle it? Why leave it in a car you were about to abandon? It was a whisper in a storm of silence, and Miller knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was the key. Robert Lang wasn't just an ordinary engineer. He was leading a secret life, and that secret had finally caught up with him. The post office box. It was a long shot, a breadcrumb on a trail gone cold, but it was all Miller had. Box 782 was registered to a Society for American Ornithology, a name so blandly official it had to be fake. After a week of bureaucratic wrangling and a few off-the-record favors, Miller obtained a warrant to monitor the box. For 2 weeks, nothing. Just dust and circulars for local hardware stores. Miller was about to give up, consigning the ad to the file of bizarre, unsolved details. Then, a letter arrived. It was a simple, thin envelope, postmarked from Pittsburgh, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing what looked like a random sequence of numbers and letters. It was a cipher. Miller, a man of simple tastes and simpler methods, knew he was out of his depth. He took the letter to a man he knew from the war, a reclusive academic named Professor Alastair Finch. Finch, with his wild grey hair and spectacles thick as bottle bottoms, had been one of the unsung heroes of naval intelligence, a master codebreaker. He looked at the sequence, a flicker of excitement in his tired eyes. "Ah," he murmured, "this is a variation of a Vigenère cipher. Old school, but effective. But it's layered. You need a keyword. Without it, it's just gibberish." A keyword. Miller's mind raced back to the car. The schematics, the notes, the apple, it was all too mundane. But there was something else, something he'd initially dismissed. Eleanor had mentioned that Robert had a peculiar habit: he would often hum or whistle tunes, but never popular songs. They were always odd, disjointed melodies she'd never heard before. On a hunch, Miller retrieved Lang's briefcase from the evidence locker. Tucked into a side pocket, almost hidden, was a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't for engineering, it was filled with musical notations. Scrawled messily on the last page were the notes for a short, simple tune, and underneath it, a single word: Corvus. Corvus, Finch repeated, his fingers flying across his charts and tables. Latin for crow or raven. Not quite a cardinal, but in the same avian family. Let's see. The professor worked in silence, the only sounds the scratching of his pencil and the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, Finch looked up, pushing his glasses up his nose. He had deciphered a fragment of the message. The decoded text was chillingly direct: "The nest is compromised. Nightingale is silent. Await instructions. Do not proceed to the meeting point." Miller felt a jolt, the kind of electric thrill that only a detective on the verge of a breakthrough can feel. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a conspiracy. Nightingale, Corvus, Cardinal, these were code names. Robert Lang was an agent, a bird in a flock of spies. The message in box 782 wasn't for him, it was from him, a warning sent to his network after he realized he was in danger. He hadn't been taken on his way to work. He had anticipated the threat and initiated his own vanishing act. The question was no longer who took Robert Lang, but what was he running from? And where, in the vast, paranoid landscape of Cold War America, could a ghost possibly hide? The discovery changed everything. Miller now looked at the case through a new lens. The clean scene at the car wasn't because the kidnappers were professionals, it was because there were no kidnappers. Lang had staged it. The unlocked doors, the keys in the ignition, it was an invitation, a deliberate misdirection. He wanted the police to find the car and assume the most obvious scenario. But he'd left a trail, a complex puzzle of breadcrumbs for someone he trusted, or someone smart enough, to follow. Miller suspected Lang never intended for the police to solve it. The circled ad was a message for his allies. By intercepting it, Miller had stumbled into a silent war being fought in the suburbs and back alleys of his own city. Miller stood before the corkboard in his office, the threads of red string forming a web of conspiracy that seemed to ensnare the entire room. Lang was a spy. His disappearance was a calculated escape. This was no longer a missing persons case, it was a matter of national security that had landed squarely in the lap of a Cleveland homicide detective. For the first time, Miller felt a prickle of genuine fear. As he walked home that night, the familiar city streets seemed different. The shadows in the alleys were deeper, the faces of strangers were masks, and the feeling of being watched was as tangible as the cold autumn wind on his neck. The name, Nightingale, became Miller's obsession. He cross-referenced it with every database he had access to, local informants, FBI watch lists, military intelligence contacts. Nothing. The name was a ghost. Frustrated, he decided to revisit the one person who, knowingly or not, was at the center of the web, Eleanor Lang. He found her packing boxes, a grim resignation on her face. I have to sell the house, she said, her voice hollow. There's no other way. Miller steered the conversation gently, asking about Robert's colleagues, his friends, anyone who might have shared his supposed love for birdwatching. Eleanor paused, a flicker of memory in her eyes. There was one person. Dr. Kane. Arlene Kane. A physicist. Robert said she was the most brilliant mind at NACA. They were close. He worried about her. She let out a small, sad laugh. We all called her the Nightingale behind her back. At the annual company picnic, she had a voice like an angel. Miller's blood ran cold. Nightingale. He asked what happened to her. Eleanor's face darkened. It was awful. She died just a week before Robert vanished. A car accident on a country road. They said she fell asleep at the wheel. A car accident. The coincidence was too loud to ignore. Miller pulled the official police report on Arlene Kane's death. It was unnervingly similar to the scene of Lang's abandoned car, clean, simple, and closed too quickly. A single vehicle crash on a clear night. No skid marks. No witnesses. The file was thin, almost dismissive. But one detail, buried in the coroner's addendum, leaped out at him. The coroner had noted faint, unusual chemical burns on the tips of her fingers, but since they weren't the cause of death, they were deemed irrelevant. Miller stared at the report, the words blurring. Nightingale is silent. It wasn't a status update. It was a death notice. Arlene Kane had been silenced, and Lang knew he was the next target on the list. That night, Miller returned to his office to catch up on paperwork. The moment he unlocked the door, he knew something was wrong. The air was still. A file on his desk was askew by a fraction of an inch. His pen was not where he had left it. Someone had been there. It was a professional search, designed to be unnoticed, a ghost slipping through his sanctum. They weren't stealing evidence, they were taking inventory of his mind, trying to figure out what he knew. Then he saw it. Lying in the center of his blotter, stark against the green leather, was a single, jet-black feather. It wasn't a clue. It was a message. A warning. The players in this game knew he was on the board. He was no longer the hunter. He was now the hunted. The black feather on his desk was a declaration of war. Miller knew he couldn't go to his captain. Reporting this would mean the case would be swallowed by federal agents, buried in a file stamped top secret, and he would be, at best, a footnote. At worst, he'd be deemed a liability. He was on his own. That night, he didn't go home. He went to a dusty, rarely used safe house his precinct maintained for witnesses. He packed a single bag, a change of clothes, his service revolver, the case file on Lang, and the black feather, now sealed in an evidence bag. He had officially gone off the grid. Frank Miller, the Cleveland detective, was now a ghost, hunting another. His first and only stop was Professor Finch's cluttered home. Finch listened intently as Miller laid out the new developments, the Nightingale connection, the suspicious death of Arlene Kane, the chemical burns, and finally, the feather. The old codebreaker held the evidence bag with the feather up to his lamp, his expression grim. "This is not a random threat, Frank," he said, his voice low. "In the quiet corners of the intelligence world, this is a known calling card. It belongs to a unit that doesn't officially exist. They are not Soviet. They are our own. A cleanup crew that deals with internal threats and leaks, operating outside of any law. They are called the Magpies, because they take what shines and leave nothing behind." So Lang and Kane weren't selling secrets, Miller pieced together, the horrible truth dawning on him. They were trying to prevent something. Something their own side was doing. Finch nodded slowly. NACA is at the bleeding edge of aerospace. Think of the power, Frank. A vehicle that can't be caught, a bomber that can't be shot down. Such a technology could destabilize the entire world. Perhaps Lang and Kane believed it was too dangerous to exist. Their nest wasn't a spy ring. It was their project. And it was compromised not by an enemy, but by powerful men on our side who wanted to weaponize it. Miller needed to know what that project was. The answer had to be with Arlene Kane. Getting a warrant for her apartment was now impossible and far too dangerous. So, for the first time in his 20-year career, Detective Frank Miller decided to commit a felony. He broke into Dr. Arlene Kane's apartment under the cover of darkness. The place had been professionally tossed, just like his office. But the magpies were looking for technical data, for microfilm. Miller was looking for a human connection. He searched not her desk, but her bookshelf. And there, he found it. A well-worn copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses. It seemed like an ordinary book, but inside the front cover was an inscription in Robert Lang's familiar handwriting. It wasn't a love note. It was a warning and a key. It read, asterisk, to Arlene. May our Icarus not fly too close to the sun. Asterisk below the inscription, Lang had written a short sequence of numbers, 41.4822 degree N, 81.6697 degrees W. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a set of coordinates. Not a meeting point for spies, but a location. A place hidden in plain sight, right here in Cleveland. He recognized the area, a series of abandoned warehouses and industrial yards near the Cuyahoga River. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This is where Lang went. Not to escape, but to finish what he and Arlene had started. Lang wasn't running. He was hiding, preparing. The car by the lake, the coded messages, it was all a brilliant, desperate misdirection to buy himself time. Miller stood in the silent apartment, the book heavy in his hands. He now faced an impossible choice. He could turn the coordinates over to the authorities, and the monstrous magpies would surely get there first, silencing Lang and seizing Project Icarus forever. Or he could go himself, alone, to confront the ghost at the end of the trail. The black feather in his pocket felt impossibly heavy. He looked out the window at the sleeping city, knowing that whatever happened at those coordinates, the story of Robert Lang, the ordinary engineer who was anything but, would never be officially told. The silence was the point. And Frank Miller was about to break it.